Hello, and thank you for taking time to watch this session of the 2021 Illinois State Historical Society Symposium titled Decolonizing and Indigenizing Museum Programming. My name is Devin Hunter, and I'm Assistant Professor of History at the University of Illinois Springfield and Chair of the ISHS Symposium Committee. In a minute, I'll introduce the moderator for the session, who will in turn introduce our guest. The theme of our symposium is Changing Historical Landscapes, with a program that features historians, artists, and community members engaged in efforts to reimagine, reinvigorate, and revise commemoration and historical interpretation throughout the state and beyond. To learn more about the program and to watch additional symposium videos, please visit the Illinois State Historical Society website at historyillinois.org or check the ISHS YouTube channel or Facebook page. This is also where you can learn more about ISHS programs and publications, and importantly, how you can support programs such as this through your donations and membership. Just as a reminder, the ISHS is an independent, not-for-profit organization founded in 1899, so we can use all the help that you can give. The moderator for the session is Jen Edgington, who is the new Director of Interpretation at the Illinois State Museum. She has over 15 years of museum work focusing on museum education, interpretation, and community collaboration. She's held positions at various museums, including the Kenosha Museum Campus, the Field Museum, Napier Settlement, and the Museum of Science and Industry. Jen has a bachelor's degree in anthropology from Michigan State University and a master's degree in education, curriculum, and instruction from University of Kansas. She's currently working toward her EDD in First Nations education at University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. And Jen is a member of the American Alliance of Museums, EdCom Steering Committee, and is a member of the American Association of State and Local History, Education and Interpretation Affinity Group. Her work is rooted in making museums more inclusive and accessible. So Jen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm very excited for this presentation, mainly because I get to present with one of my dear friends. So I'm very happy to introduce Heather Briegel, and I will give her bio in just 1 minute. I did want to say originally we had a very good friend, David O'Connor, who was going to present with us, and we'll introduce him a little bit later. He was unfortunately not able to join us, but his thoughts and his work is rooted in the work we're presenting today. So we want to make sure that we, although he's not in our space with us, he's definitely present in our presentation. So I'm going to introduce Heather very quickly. Heather Briegel is a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and first-line descendant of Stockbridge Munsee, is a graduate student of Madonna University in Michigan, and holds a Bachelor's of Art and a Master's of Art in U.S. History. Inspired by a trip to Wounded Knee, South Dakota, a passion for Native American history was born. She has spoken for numerous groups, including University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin-Madison, College of Menominee Nation, the Kenosha Civil War Museum, Stockbridge Munsee Band of Mohican, and the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. She has spoken at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh for Indigenous Peoples Day in 2017. Heather also opened up and spoke at the Women's March anniversary in Lansing, Michigan in January 2018. She also spoke at the first ever Indigenous Peoples March in Washington, D.C. in January 2019. In the summer of 2019 and virtually in 2020, she spoke at the Crazy Horse Memorial and Museum in Custer, South Dakota for their Talking Circle series. She has also become an accidental activist and speaks to different groups about intergenerational racism and trauma, and helps to bring awareness to our environment, the fight for clean water, and other issues in Native country. The curiosity of her own heritage led her to Wisconsin, where she has researched the history of Native American tribes in the area. While Heather calls Michigan home, she recently moved to Wisconsin and is now the Director of Cultural Affairs for the Stockbridge Munsee community. In addition to that, she also currently travels and speaks on Native American history, including policy and activism. Heather, as always, I'm so happy to have you here with me.
I'm excited to be here, Jen. Yay!
So We'll get started with our presentation. This one is called Decolonizing and Indigenizing Museum Education Programming. As you can tell, we both are very involved in museums, and so we were trying to find a way to really focus on not so much the collection, but on the way that Native people and Indigenous people are presented within the walls and outside the walls of museums. So we'll, really quick, I know we just introduced ourselves, but we'll give our email addresses. Oh, first we'll do our land acknowledgement.
Yeah, so land acknowledgements are so important, and we're going to get into that in a minute, but we want to just acknowledge the land that we're on, and Jen and I are coming from 2 different states, but many of these tribes, because there were no boundaries, cross over into both states. So it's with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are speaking on the ancestral homelands of the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, Oneida, Stockbridge, Muncie, and Peoria, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. And so Jen already introduced me, so you know who I am, but my email is up here as well, heather.briegel@mohegan-nsn.gov. You can also find me on Twitter at Heather Briegel, and of course on the Instagram at Heather M. Briegel. And then you can follow my museum and our Cultural Affairs Department on Facebook, because we are doing a lot of things virtually now at Arvid E. Miller Memorial Library and Museum on Facebook. So that's just me. Jen, do you want to talk about David?
So again, David is a good friend of ours that we often present with, and he's a great thought partner. He unfortunately is not able to join us today, but again, his work is really rooted in what Heather and I do, and we work together pretty regularly on our work. So David O'Connor is an enrolled member of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. He's Ojibwe or Anishinaabe. And his current position is he actually works for the Department of Public Instruction in the state of Wisconsin, and making sure that Indigenous people are taught in the classroom and to teachers. So he deals a lot with Act 31, which is up in Wisconsin. He also is the grant director for the network, which allows teachers, again, to learn a little bit more about Indigenous histories and cultures. And his email is up here. He's sorry he can't be with us today.
Yeah, but he totally wanted to share his email in case anyone had any questions for him. So,
absolutely. And then, hello, I'm Jen Hedgington. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Director of Interpretation at the Illinois State Museum, and I'm relatively new here. And my email is jennifer.edgington@illinois.gov. So today, just briefly, we've done this talk many times, but we're kind of condensing it for today. So we're going to focus on words and representation and why they're important. We're going to talk about what cultural inclusive history is and how you can do it, how you can read about it, how you can learn about it, and how you should be learning about it. And then if you work at an institution that provides partnerships and collaborations, how do you conduct those things?
So the first thing we're going to talk about is land acknowledgements. I do a much longer version of how to do a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to do it super condensed here for you today, because these land acknowledgements are the easiest thing I think an institution, cultural or educational institution, can do. They're super simple. And so I've kind of boiled it down into 5 simple steps. And also I'll give you a little bit of information on each step, and then we'll look at the example at the bottom below. So if you are not familiar with Stockbridge Muncie community, we are Mohegan Nation. We're originally from out east. We made our home along the Mahicanatuck River, in the Mahicanatuck River Valley, and parts of the Berkshires in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, different areas out there. And so we oftentimes, from institutions out east, get asked about a land acknowledgement. So we came up with a land acknowledgement. We wrote ours for our department, and we send it to organizations that ask for it as a template, but they need to build on it. And so these are some steps that you need to build on. But if you do not know where to even start on how to do a land acknowledgement, this is a good stepping point to do it. So first, you're going to want to do your research, because you shouldn't assume you know whose land you're on, because I can guarantee you that you are on the lands of more than one nation. So you might have only ever heard, oh, I'm on Ho-Chunk land, oh, I'm on Lakota land, what have you. There are resources out there, and we will provide some to you, where you can learn about the land that you're on and realize that you might be in more than one nation being represented. For example, Chicago, even though it's a hub today for Amtrak and for airlines, it was kind of also a hub for Native nations, traveling to and from hunting grounds. And so Chicago isn't just home to one nation, it's home to several nations. So you're gonna want to research and find out whose land you're actually on. The second step is you're going to want to reach out to the nations that you're trying to acknowledge. So after you do that research, you're then gonna wanna reach out to those nations, and you're gonna say, hey, my org is trying to do a land acknowledgement. You're going to want to include them. You're going to want to find out if they have one that's already written. And you're going to want to partner with them, because it's important. But you're also going to have to take into consideration and understand that land acknowledgements are time-consuming and emotional work. So you're going to want to make sure that whoever you are working with within that Native nation is compensated in some way, shape, or form, whether that's to that person directly or a donation to the nation itself, because it's hard work, particularly if that nation is no longer located on their ancestral lands, if they've been physically forced removed. So like Mohican Nation was moved out of the East, we're no longer in the East. That's hard. You're asking us to bring up some of that emotional trauma of being removed, and you've got to go into it understanding that it's going to be hard work. The third thing is you're going to want to ask for participation from that nation. Again, ask if they already have one. See if they want to participate in the one that you're working on. If they decline, that doesn't give you an out. You still need to do the land acknowledgement. You're just going to want to make sure that you are doing it respectfully, and sending them drafts that you're writing, ask for feedback and things like that. So it's not just we're going to write this land acknowledgement and it's going to be super simple. I've worked on land acknowledgements before with other institutions, and I've sent back 4 or 5 email chains of rewrites, and giving advice and walking a group through that. So number 4, you want to honor the past home in addition to the current location. So it's part of the land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements are a key to keeping Indigenous lives alive and history alive. But a land acknowledgement cannot and it should not exist in the past. You should be honoring that past, but also making note of that present. So it's important to note that a nation, we were Mohican Nation in the past. We're not necessarily referred to as Mohican Nation contemporarily. We are Stockbridge Munsee community. It's important to know that. So you can't just have a land acknowledgement and say, we are honoring the land of the Mohican people, period, full stop. There's more to that story. When you end a land acknowledgement without acknowledging the contemporary, you are inadvertently helping to lead to the erasure of a people. So you want to make sure that you are acknowledging that contemporary. Where is the community now? What names do they go by? And because we're still out there, we're a thriving and vibrant community. So that's super important. Number 5 is you want to add an action item, and that action item has to have substance. There has to be real substantial change behind that action item. Otherwise, it's just words on paper and it doesn't mean anything. So examples of action are, my brain just totally went blank. Okay, wait. Supporting Native-led causes and campaigns, supporting Native-led businesses, making time or monetary donations to Native nations. An action item can be as simple as reading a book about a nation, sharing that book, that knowledge, watching a documentary, being cognitively aware, getting out in nature and being a steward of that land that you're trying to protect. So they don't have to be super extravagant. They can be very simple as well, but there has to be substantial change or else it doesn't mean anything. So I have the example of the land acknowledgement that we wrote for Stockbridge Munsee on the page here. So obviously at the beginning, you know, we're honoring the land that we're speaking, learning, and gathering on. We have different names, so we include our Mohican name, which is the Mahikaniak people, or Mohican people, or Munsee Lenape people, because we are Stockbridge Munsee. So depending on who's asking for this acknowledgement, you can insert the proper name. We also talk about the tremendous hardship of being forced from our homelands today, but where we currently reside, which is in Wisconsin, and what we're known as the Stockbridge Munsee community. So we use that language. Don't be afraid to use forceful language, forced removal, stolen land. It's okay to use that. And we kind of do that a little bit here. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. So that's your action item. Your action item is building that inclusive and equitable space. But then in a larger context, especially if you're a cultural institution, you need to have more listed. Resources where people can learn more about the nations. What is your institution doing? So there's gotta be more there. So this is just a small example of what land acknowledgements are. And then we do have a couple of resources that David did give to us, nativegov.org and usdac.us/nativeland, that do talk more about land acknowledgements, how to do them. And again, you have access to my email and I can answer any questions that you have, but it's the simplest thing that as an organization you can do, is to honor that land, honor the Indigenous history.
So our whole presentation and what Heather's talking about is just simple activities and things that are showing progress towards decolonization and indigenizing spaces for all, right? And making things inclusive, bringing Native people into the conversation instead of excluding them like it has been done throughout history. Right? And so we just want to make sure we know vocabulary words, because oftentimes decolonization is thrown out there. Indigenizing is not as much used, but we want to use it here. So decolonizing, this is taken from an article from the Washington Post, is a process that institutions undergo to expand the perspective they portray beyond those of the dominant culture group, particularly white colonizers. The one thing I will say is there's some really amazing work being done by Indigenous scholars that are pushing that decolonization is not a metaphor for something else. It's actually not an opportunity for us to kind of shove in all the groups we should be talking about, but it's really focusing on Indigenous histories and Indigenous cultures. Oftentimes we hear decolonization with collections at museums, so making sure that we are repatriating when possible, and then also bringing things into contemporary perspective and recentering and privileging Native voices in the conversation by working with Native people. Indigenizing, and the three of us just had this amazing discussion about this like a half an hour before this presentation, because David asked me during one of my past presentations to go a step further and actually talk about indigenizing. And indigenizing is to adapt Indigenous conditions or practices, but the way we see it, it's really centering Indigenous people. It's inviting them to the table, but also to lead the table. It's turning the perspective Western facing, Eastern facing, and that's really important, is that we make sure that we are recentering that Westernized world we live in to understand that there are more than one perspective, and in this case with indigenizing, Indigenous perspective is the center. So I just wanted to make sure we knew the difference between those. And so with that comes along a lot of the words and language that we need to be mindful of to make sure that we are practicing decolonization and indigenizing in our everyday life. And this is just good practice. Being inclusive with our language is something we should be doing. So some of the questions that we get often, or we've run into, and Heather can attest, is what is the correct way to address Indigenous people? So you hear sometimes tribes or nations. I know that for a lot of tribal nations, I combine them, you often hear communities, you'll hear tribal nations. Tribes themselves is not necessarily referred to as often anymore as they used to be, because by saying nation, by saying community, you're actually putting the emphasis on the actual people coming together, and that's what's really important. And in particular with nations, it's showing that they're sovereign nations within the United States. As for other language, we often get asked, there's American Indian, Native American, Indigenous, First Nations, Original Peoples. What's the correct term? It really should be tribal specific if you know their word, if you know what tribal affiliation they have. However, if it's more of a general, any of those are okay in our area. I know personally I use Indigenous people a lot because I try not to limit it just to the United States Indigenous people. So I included kind of Canada and Mexico with that. But I do know I also say Native a lot. And in Wisconsin in particular, there was a lot of Indigenous people that requested American Indian be used because if you were to say, like me personally, I'm Mexican American, Mexican is showing my country of origin, and in that case, American is showing their country of origin. So they were here first, basically. I know, Heather, you prefer Indigenous, correct?
I do, yes, absolutely. I prefer Indigenous. I get this question asked a lot, and I usually just tell people, because, you know, when I'm talking about federal Indian policy or things like that, Indian is written right into the work. So it's not necessarily wrong, it's personal preference. So it's kind of like pronouns. If you're not sure, ask. So if you're not sure, you know, you're encountering your Indigenous friend and you're not sure if they want to be called Indigenous, Native American, American Indian, Indian, Anishinaabe, Oneida, Lakota, just ask.
Absolutely. And one of the, and this actually comes from David, and I think that this is so incredibly important, is he teaches teachers that are getting ready to teach history. And so when we're talking about American history versus US history, because there's not an America, right? Because there's several different Americas. There's South America, Central America, and North America, and then the United States of America. So when we're talking about histories, we want to be specific, and we also want to be inclusive. So if we're talking about United States history, we also need to include Indigenous people in that conversation, with Latinx people, African Americans. It's not just one history that fits all. So, yeah. And this is a sign from Wisconsin that is still up, and we wanted to just show why representation matters. And so this is a historical sign that is on the red banks of Green Bay, and it's only talking about Indigenous people in the past, and it's actually using some pretty not so great descriptive words, a story that's not fantastic, and it uses the wrong word for the tribal nation that it's talking about. So it talks about the Winnebago. That is now what is called the Ho-Chunk. The Ho-Chunk people want to be called Ho-Chunk. We need to honor that. As those that are not in that community or members of that community, we need to change, if we have labels in a museum, if we have textbooks, to make sure that they are being dressed the way that they should be. And I will really quick say representation does matter in museums and other cultural institutions. And Heather, I'm going to tell your story. I went to a museum with Heather and we were walking through, and there was an Oneida story that was featured. And I remember looking over and seeing Heather cry a little bit because she said, I get to see someone that looks like me. And I think that that's so incredibly powerful. And as a friend and an ally and an advocate and an accomplice, really, I was so excited by that moment that it stayed with me in my heart, and that's what I want to continue my work
Yeah, it was a very powerful moment. I got to see myself inside a museum, and and not just portrayed as the noble savage, but it was a real portrayal, and it was amazing. So, culturally inclusive history, why do it? I mean, the answer to that should be duh. Why wouldn't you do it? But textbooks on an everyday basis are getting these things wrong. And we have the power to change the narrative. And it's so important that we do that. This is just 2 examples that I found searching a simple Google search. So you can find these. The first one is in this photo. So what are the misses here? The first one, when the European settlers arrived, they needed land to live on. The First Nations people agreed to move to different areas to make room for the new settlements. So First Nations, number 1, tells me this is out of Canada. And number 2, the second thing is First Nations people agreed to move out of the areas? We were just being nice? No, forced removal is what happened. And in the United States in 1830, you actually had the Indian Removal Act, which forcibly moved Native nations that were east of the Mississippi to west of the Mississippi. It wasn't we were not going to go gentle into that good night. We fought to try to stay on our land. So a history book here gets it wrong. The second photo, the Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. Brought millions of workers. No, they brought millions of people who they then enslaved and forced to do this hard labor. So it is important to understand that our history books are not always getting it right. I can guarantee you the story you learned about Thanksgiving from your history book is not accurate. I can also guarantee you the story that you learned about Pocahontas from your history book is not accurate. So it's important that we get that we are inclusive in that cultural history. But how do we include it? Some people might be thinking, well, how do I do that? It's super simple. The history is already there. You just have to talk about it. So really quickly, I'll give you 4 examples. You've got Crispus Attucks, who was the first person who died at the Boston Massacre. Crispus Attucks was of Afro and Indigenous descent. Boom, right there, you did it. You just included Indigenous history by talking about Crispus Attucks. You've got the Haudenosaunee flag. When you are talking in your political science classes, your civics classes about the formation of the US government, guess what? That was based off of the Haudenosaunee form of government. So it's already there. You just have to bring it in. When you're talking about the Civil War and the divisiveness that was between the North and the South and all of the formation of the Confederate Army, the formation of the Union Army and all the different companies, don't forget to talk about Company K, which was an indigenous company of sharpshooters, the best sharpshooters, formed out of the state of Michigan, who every time they went on a mission, they were successful. They were the best sharpshooting company in the Union. When you are talking about the civil rights movement of the 1950s, 60s, and I'm even going to go as far as say 2020 and 2021, you are including all of these different things. You're talking about the Black-led civil rights movement, second wave feminism. Guess what? The LGBTQ movement and the American Indian movement all were happening at the same time. So make sure when you are talking about that civil rights movement, you are encompassing everything, including the American Indian movement, which made great strides for Indian country during this time. Got us a seat at the table again with treaty negotiations, got us on the front page of the news, and helped organize Indigenous-led mass protests at Plymouth Rock, Mount Rushmore, Alcatraz, Wounded Knee, all of these different places that brought everything to the forefront. So you've got all of these things happening in history. They're all sitting right there for you. They're just waiting for you to include them. And it takes literally 30 seconds if you want to include some of that Indigenous history in there.
So in museums themselves, we wanted to look at how do we bring in different histories, and both Heather and I work in museums, so that's natural fit for us. And so some of the ways that we have done this work, or Heather's been on the other end of this work too, is you need to make sure that you're working with tribal community members or tribal nations to develop what they want to see. A lot of museums center themselves in these partnership conversations, and you need to be centering the Indigenous perspective. So what do they want? What can museums do for the tribal community, not what can the tribal community do for museums? And it's a shift, right? And then it's also something to ask ourselves, what other people were there in history? Like Heather's talking about, there's other people that saw history happen. Maybe they're not what we hear every day in our textbooks, but that does not mean that they weren't there and that their stories are not valid. So how can we hear more of their stories, tell more of their stories, and make sure that they're present as we move forward in history books, in conversations, and exhibits, and everything else? Something that I think a lot of people fall into when doing programming, or with schools in particular, is Heritage Months. It's really easy to kind of correspond all your lessons, all your ed programs to the Heritage Month itself, right? So November is Native American Heritage Month, and Heather is inundated with requests on Native history in that month of November, and she's not the only one. So how do we instead move beyond? Because Heather and David, as he'll attest, live beyond the scope of November, and their history and story is important all year. If we can, make your work community specific. So instead of being very broad, and I'm going to talk about American Indian history, no, focus. Are we going to talk about Ojibwe or Potawatomi history? Are we going to focus on Kickapoo or Peoria? That way, we are really focusing our lenses onto one specific community, and we can do the justice that it deserves. Lastly, if you work in a cultural institution, if you work in a school, and in our case, if you work in a museum, invite in Indigenous historians, storytellers, language bearers, or artists to present their own works. As an ally, as an authentic ally, we can do some of the work, but we need to be working in collaboration with our Indigenous partners to make sure that their stories are being told correctly and authentically. So invite them into your space, give them space to work, and make sure you compensate them too. So I'll talk a little bit about partners, because I've done a lot of partner work in my former job at the Kenosha Museum campus, and then also in my current role. So when you're looking at building partnerships with Indigenous communities, if it's, again, a museum, a cultural institution, you really need to look at your own staff and partners. Who are they and who are you missing? Who is not at that table? And oftentimes, it's usually Indigenous people are not at that table. So how do you invite them in? What's really important is reevaluating power dynamics as you enter into a partnership. You have to look at what collections is your museum holding that might establish a power of a museum over the Indigenous community, and how can you equal that out? That's incredibly important. Something I've learned is to work with the youth. If you empower the youth, adults and elders are going to be joining that conversation, because there's such a great intergenerational trust within Indigenous and also in Latinx communities. Again, as I said, pay your experts. That's incredibly important, because there's a lot of labor that goes into these programs and new partnerships. Make sure you do that. Reach out, to tribal community members, but do your research first. Don't just blind email them and ask really easy questions that maybe Google might be a better fit for. It's when you're able to work with tribal community members, it really is a privilege to be able to work in partnership with them. And so you want to make sure that you're able to work with them, so it's not a one-sided partnership, because that's not great. And then again, move away from just Indigenous histories, just in November. And I know we're kind of short on time, so we'll go through these really quick. So some of the ways that you can do Indigenous programming is you can bring in artists into your talk. You can do actual hands-on crafts. You can do exhibits with Indigenous artists. Let's see. There are a lot of books out by Indigenous poets and short story authors, and being able to bring in storytellers and language bearers themselves. So at my old museum, we actually brought in Potawatomi lessons so that we could reintroduce the language on the land that the Potawatomi were once in. This gentleman here is Skip, who is a storyteller. He's a Potawatomi storyteller, and he would come in the winter to do storytelling for us. And then examples of the youth-led exhibits. So this here is, we worked at my own museum with a group of Indigenous youth to tell their own stories. We really turned over the museum to them with pretty limited limitations to their creativity. It basically had to be, could fit in the door and it was safe. And we made sure that we also then listened to the community and what they needed. So they needed things like an elder cafe. We made sure that there was a space for elders to eat, to relax, to take rest if needed. And we also found out that they would like a marketplace for the parents of the school to sell. So we made sure there was a marketplace. We wanted to make sure that everybody felt safe, secure, and welcome in our space. And we did that the best way we could, which was really turn over our partnership and make it youth-centered. They made the decisions. We were just there to say like, oh, that sounds dangerous, or that's a little too big to fit in our door. That was and then the last one, so this is our Day of the Dead. Similar, we worked with high school students, and this was at my former museum as well. And we partnered with youth that were Spanish speakers at home. And so they created labels in both English and in Spanish. They presented to the public in Spanish and in English, and they celebrated cultural touchstones for themselves. We let them kind of have control again of the museum. And my personal favorite was they wanted to bring in a live animal. And I told them, well, I have to ask the director. And they tracked down the director himself and asked him if they could do it. So this group of high school students did that. But they also fell so in love with the museum because they felt so safe and secure, and they knew who we were, that some of them came back and took like Kinesiera pictures and stuff. So I think that that's incredibly important to build these partnerships and relationships, especially with Indigenous youth and with youth that's in marginalized groups that we don't often address with school programming that's often that Western mind frame. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Devin again, but please reach out to us. That's my old email. Used my email before.
Yeah, that is your old email?
It is. We didn't change it. But yes.
Well, thank you both so much for talking about this work. And, you know, I was thinking of a few questions as you're giving some of these examples. And, you know, one question I had, I think was largely addressed in that last bit there by Jen with some of these examples, is that, you know, we so often think of decolonizing, indigenizing, rematriation, all these things as like projects of big organizations, the Field Museum, or, you know, that type of thing. It's got a big budget that can bring on advisors or shift people's work towards this, you know, like you point out, labor intensive or should be labor intensive work. And I know that I would imagine that a lot of our audience, you know, works at small historical societies, small museums that maybe have a full-time director and maybe a part-time person or a bunch of volunteers. And maybe it's a organization, a site, a museum that has a traditionally been a very strong narrative of, you know, white settlement and all these things. And I think with that last piece, we saw some examples that even small places can do. It doesn't take a huge budget or, or consultants to come in, this type of thing. So is there anything else you want to add, like a small place can do towards this work? Or
Yeah,
like an
I mean,
example, of a place, like a small place that's like, hey, that's what I like to see.
I think that there's a lot of really great places that are doing some work decolonizing themselves. There's so much that as authentic allies, we can start the process, like I said, but we really should be working in collaboration with Indigenous people, and things like a language lesson or a storytelling, that's not as large as like bringing in a consultant to sit at the table all the time. But recentering the stories and working with an Indigenous historian, maybe to look over your exhibit might be a good one. Bring in artists and allow your temporary exhibit to be Indigenous focused and not designed by you, but curated by them. Might be a great one. Heather, do you have any other ideas?
Yeah, I think, I think sometimes smaller institutions do run into that financial or whatever issue that they might have, but that doesn't mean that you should use that as an excuse, because you can get over that financial hurdle just by talking with an Indigenous consultant or somebody and explaining the situation. And I can guarantee you that they will still find a way to work with you. I'm working with a small historical society out in our homeland who a new director just took over, and she looked at their permanent exhibit and she was just like, this is not acceptable. And so like right now, small changes we're making is, they can't, obviously they're not in a position where they can replace everything. What you can easily replace is the story that goes along with it. So I'm looking over the script that they have now and just making small tweaks here and there that kind of make it a little bit more inclusive to the story. And so I think that that's something that smaller historical societies or museums can do, is look what you've got already. How can you work with what you have and kind of flip it? Because again, we do understand there are financial constrictions. I mean, if you're not the Field Museum or the National or NMAI and the Smithsonian, you might not have the budget.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for those examples. Somewhat related question is, what on an Illinois context, and I think, and you alluded to some of both of you alluded to some of these issues. What some of the advantages or challenges, and some of the opportunities that are unique in Illinois in doing this work, right? So you talked about like engaging communities and nations. Like in Illinois context, we have obviously every state has this sort of unique relationship with the history of this. But what do you see as like the challenges and opportunities here in the state?
Yeah, I think I was particularly lucky coming from Wisconsin, because there are 12 tribal communities that call Wisconsin home, and moving to Illinois, there's not. We are on ancestral land, we are on removed land. So I think that it's incredibly important for us to remember everyone who was here and honor them and bring them to the conversation, because there is a lot more tribal nations that can be reached out to. But I think it's incredibly important to remember Chicago has a high population of Indigenous people as well. And they did not necessarily come from the removed nations in Illinois. So we have an opportunity to really make a difference, because we can be talking to Indigenous peoples whose ancestral land we are on currently, but then we can also talk to the people who are contemporary Indigenous people who are living in the state of Illinois, and how do we bridge that gap and talk to all Indigenous people that have once lived or currently live here. So in particular, I think Chicago is a wealth of opportunity. I mean, Indigenous people don't just live in Chicago, they're throughout the whole state. But when we move forward with planning, in particular at our museum that I'm at now, we're looking at the scope of the removed tribal communities as well as those that are still here in the state.
Great. Thanks for that answer. And unless there's anything else, I think we'll wrap up. Everyone has your contact information. And I should note that this is recorded on April 13th, 2021. And if you're watching this before April 22nd, you will take a look at the ISHS Symposium schedule for some live events on the 22nd through 24th, some of which that relate directly to this topic, more opportunities to learn more about it and to interact with our panelists. Other than that, Jen, Heather, thank you so much. And we look forward to more conversations like this down the road with ISHS and any other kind of stakeholders in the state. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.